the Russian way of waging war hasn't changed, I don't think, in 200, 250, and really since Russia became a military force. So how Russia is waging war at the moment is really no surprise. A big mistake that we might make in the West is that we view Vladimir Putin and we view the Kremlin's way of waging war through Western eyes, which is a wrong thing to do. You've got to look at it through the Russian way, the Russian way of looking at things, and how Vladimir Putin looks at things. Look at it through his lens, which is very difficult to do, because I think it's pretty hard to get inside his mind to understand exactly what he's doing, because everything he does seems to be against logic.
So you feel that Georgia was a wake-up call?
Absolutely. Oh my goodness. I arrived at NATO, maybe about a year after Georgia, and it was forefront on everybody's mind. And many of the bureaucrats in NATO the civilian bureaucrats who have been there, were deeply ashamed that, I don't know if ashamed is the right word, but they were shaken by it, because they felt that they were asleep at the wheel. And then they realized that NATO was not ready, that they weren't ready mentally, they weren't ready materially. And Ukraine only drove that point home unequivocally. And there is a direct line. There's in the basement of the Pentagon, there's an office that has an open phone line between the Kremlin and the Pentagon. And there's a staff of officers that sit in there waiting for the phone to ring, that are all fluent Russian speakers. It was right across the hallway from me, to ensure that those lines of communication are always open. That's absolutely vital. And that's really, I mean, it sounds strange that we are giving weapons to a proxy country to kill Russian soldiers, but yet we still have lines of communication open. But that's because both sides recognize that if we don't do that, if there is no communication, that's when bad things happen.
Has that phone ever rang while you were around?
Yeah, it rings every day just to test it.
Hi, everyone. You're listening and watching Rashkin Report. My name is Yuri Rashkin, and I am very excited to have you join us today. We're going to be speaking with Captain retired Tim Kinsella, who was commanding officer at Naval Air Station Base in Pensacola, which is where pilots go through to get their training. And that's really, such a crucial place for our military. So, Captain Kinsella, welcome to the program. Thrilled to have you with us. We have so many questions.
It's a pleasure to be here, Yuri. Thanks for having me.
First, where I would like to begin is this. You are retired, so first of all, thank you for your service. But can you tell us a little bit about the difference between opinions expressed by retired military officers versus those still on duty? Does it mean that a retired officer will tell us what people on duty are not allowed to say, or what is the difference?
Yuri, I really appreciate you asking that question, because there is a big difference. Those who are still in uniform and are on active duty, what they say may be construed as being the opinion of the United States government. Whereas me, I'm a private citizen now. So anything that I express is my opinion, my view. And yeah, I think you're kind of right also, is that somebody who is retired is not beholden to the same rules and regulations that somebody in uniform is. So you're a little bit freer to say what you think is really happening and what's really on your mind. But then you also have to keep in mind too that I am retired, so I'm a few months out of active service, so I may not have the insight that somebody who's working in the corridors of the Pentagon may have at the moment.
Precisely. So you don't have the most current, up-to-date information, but you have all your experience.
That's right. That's right.
Fantastic. Well, what is your general view of the war in Ukraine? This is kind of what this channel, this podcast, vlog centers its attention on. It seems like this is really one of the main topics in our world right now, but it is particularly important for our listeners and viewers, many of whom are in Ukraine and in Russia and all over the world, as the Russian speakers have been kind of leaving Russia in droves. There's almost an exodus going on while the borders are still open. And so your opinion is very interesting to our listeners. What is your take on the war in Ukraine right now?
My goodness, how much time do you have? That's a pretty broad question. So I'll take basically when you cut it all down, when you cut away all of the noise and all of the different opinions that you see in media today, I think it comes down to one thing, and that this is a direct conflict between totalitarianism and pluralism, a totalitarian way of government and a pluralistic way of government. It is a battle. It is a proxy battle between those who would like to see a totalitarian type government and agree that that's a way of the future for our world, versus our traditional liberal Western thought and our belief that governments based in plurality and respect for human rights is the way that we should be living our lives and the way of the future for the world. And I think that is quite evident in the countries that support or feign to support Vladimir Putin in his efforts, and those that are against him. And I think the battle lines have been drawn quite starkly.
How do you view what's going on the field, especially since your experience, you're a helicopter pilot, but you were in charge of, basically, as I see it, a school for pilots. Planes right now are a big topic for conversation. The F16, F35, different Soviet planes. What is your level of, what is your opinion on all that conversation?
Well, first I'd say I don't think there's anybody that could argue about how amazing the Ukrainian military and really just the Ukrainian people have done. Their resiliency has been just impressive and inspiring beyond belief. I don't think we've seen anything like this on the modern battlefield. I mean, really ever. It's been quite amazing to watch. The Russian way of waging war hasn't changed, I don't think, in 250, and really since Russia became a military force. So how Russia is waging war at the moment is really no surprise. A big mistake that we might make in the West is that we view Vladimir Putin and we view the Kremlin's way of waging war through Western eyes, which is a wrong thing to do. You've got to look at it through the Russian way, the Russian way of looking at things, and how Vladimir Putin looks at things. Look at it through his lens, which is very difficult to do, because I think it's pretty hard to get inside his mind to understand exactly what he's doing, because everything he does seems to be against logic. So when you think about the Russian way of waging war and how they've done it in the past, Ukraine's difficulties, you understand how difficult it is going to be in the future, because Russia doesn't care about this regime in particular, doesn't care about losses. They don't care about casualties. If we look at World War II as an example, Russia didn't do very well in the battlefield at all at the beginning, and then they got their act together, and then they mobilized their troops, they mobilized their forces. 80% of all German casualties in World War II happened on the Eastern Front. That's something that's often forgotten in the West. And Russia's their complete and overwhelming total war concept. You know, how they threw everything that they had into the war because it was a fight for survival. And I think that Putin almost sees the Ukraine as a fight for Russia's survival, and it's a fight for his survival, because in my view, he associates his survival with the survival of Russia. When you have a totalitarian leader, they often associate their own survival with the survival of their country. And that's a very, very dangerous concept. So what is he willing to do to ensure his own survival, which he associates with the survival of his own country? And I don't think there's any limits to that. So what does that mean for the fight on the ground in the future? It means that the Western countries have to give Ukraine what she needs in order to combat the almost inexhaustive supply of personnel that Russia has. And Ukraine has to do it with technology that she doesn't have, that the Western countries have. And that means technologically advanced fighter jets. That means better tanks. It means more artillery shells. But there are huge challenges with doing that, because with those advanced weapons becomes a advanced system, a system of systems that you need to be able to use those weapons effectively. Because if you have, say, an F16 or an F-35, but it doesn't have the support systems that are necessary to take advantage of those technologically advanced weapon systems, then they're just a truck. They're just as good as a third generation fighter was before, because they're not taking advantage of those great technological leaps that we've had in the West. So when we see a resistance to sending F-16s and advanced tanks and so forth, there's a lot more to it than what you see in the press. There's real training and infrastructure challenges with doing that. I mean, an Abrams tank, it's got essentially a jet engine in the back as its propulsion. So it's not just a diesel engine in there. And does Ukraine have all the necessary parts, equipment, training, and so forth to be able to successfully maintain an M1 Abrams? It takes a lot to do that, and they are gas guzzlers. Now, they're built for Eastern Europe. That's why they were designed. But they were also built in the mind that we would have a pretty robust logistical stream to help maintain them. And it's the same with the jets. So there's no doubt in my mind that Ukraine needs those things, but they also need the infrastructure to be able to maintain them and use them to their fullest capacity.
So that sounds like we need to work on the infrastructure and we need to set everything in place, but also training of pilots is a big feature, and that's something that really, that's your specialty. How do you feel about how long, because we see already that I think 2 Ukrainian pilots that went through training, that they completed it in less amount of time than standard expects. Does it mean that motivated people are faster learners, or how long does it take to learn such sophisticated machinery? What is your take on that?
Yeah, so if you take one of our naval aviators, it takes about 2 years to get your wings, just your wings of gold. But then once you get your wings, that only means that you know how to fly the aircraft. It doesn't mean that you're tactically proficient. You know how to use the weapon systems and so forth. And that takes, and before you become really a combat ready pilot, that takes another year to year and a half for you to do that. So you're talking anywhere from 3 to 4 years before a pilot becomes combat efficient. And that's in our system at the moment. And that's something that we struggle with in the United States, because if we were to enter into a significant conflict, how would we resupply our pilots and our aviators at a sustainable rate to sustain the losses that we might see? It's something that we work on, and it's something that we think about and how we can do that. Now, taking Ukrainian pilots, I'm not sure, because again, I'm a bit removed from it. So I'm not sure exactly whether they already had some flight experience or they were just raw nuggets that were coming in and we're teaching them from the beginning. But if you take somebody who already had some aviation experience, then obviously that increases the timeline. And if you are taking folks that this is all that, you can compress that timeline as necessary, because we have a lot of competing interests with our pilots as they're going through training. So you can compress that. So absolutely, there's opportunity to increase the amount of time it takes to train. There's no doubt about that. It's really as much as the human brain can absorb in one time, and how much fatigue that they can go through to do it. But these Ukrainian pilots, there's a lot of motivation there. When you're fighting for your homeland and your country, I'm sure that's the case.
Captain Kinsella, that is a very interesting thing you said, that compress the timeline. How much can you compress that timeline? Can you compress it to a week, or can you compress it by a couple? Like what is realistic there?
So if you take say a 2-year timeline, a typical 2-year timeline to get let's say a F-18 pilot to get his wings. Now he hasn't even gotten into an F-18 yet. So that's just for him to be proficient in flying a jet and how to land on an aircraft carrier. That's about 2 years. So if you were to compress that, there's a lot of things involved in there. He's traveling from one duty station to another. There's availability of aircraft. There's a lot of things that are not associated with the individual, but associated with the system. So you'd have to create a system that would get rid of those, let's say, those spaces in the training timeline. So if you were to co-locate things, for example, or if you had greater aircraft availability, we have a lot of pilots going through every year. Hundreds and hundreds are going through every year. So we have only so many aircraft that we can put them through to get them trained. So that's really where the as we said, the long pole in the tent is. It's aircraft availability, it's classroom availability, things like that. But I think you could, in an emergency situation, from 2 years go down to 18 months pretty quickly, maybe even a year, pretty quick, you could do that pretty quickly as if you dedicated the proper resources to it. And again, that's just to get them proficient in an aircraft without ever getting in it. And then you could compress, say, the year it takes you, a year and a half it takes you to be tactically proficient in an F-18. You might be able to compress that to about half the time if you had the available aircraft and the available resources to do it.
That's really
yeah. So as with anything in the military, it's logistics. Wars are won on logistics. It's if you have the logistics to be able to do it and a system put in place to do it, you can push folks through pretty quickly.
Captain Kinsella, your experience is amazing because you were also a defense planner for NATO at the Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers in Belgium. And during your time with NATO, you were responsible for negotiating with member nations on their contributions to the alliance. Boy, that's an interesting topic. How do you see the interest of NATO members these days to increase their military spending? And what was your experience like in your position?
It was fascinating. It really was. It was fascinating to see how each member nation viewed the threats to NATO and the importance of those to the member nations. So if I were to sit down with a Polish colleague and I would say, what is the greatest threat to your national security? I'll give you one guess what it is. It's right. It's Russia. Of course it is. Of course it is. Now, I asked several Spanish colleagues, what is your greatest threat to national security? How can NATO help you, and why are you a member of NATO? And each one, to a person, said, I won't even ask you to guess because you probably wouldn't get it. They said Morocco. Why Morocco? Because, right, Morocco. What has Morocco got to do anything? Because there are, from their perspective, from the Spanish perspective, there are disputes over territory. There's disputes over various islands around the Strait of Gibraltar, off the Western Africa coast, and there are fisheries protections issues. So that's what's forefront on their mind. Because if you think, if there is a war with Russia on the Eastern Front, the Russians are not going to be marching down the boulevards of Madrid because there's a lot of space for them to get through before they get there. So I say this because the motivations from our NATO allies on the southern flank is a lot different than the motivations of our allies who are on the northern and northeastern flank. Our Norwegian colleagues, for years and years, have been banging the table saying that we need to pay more attention to the high north, because in the future the high north is it's mineral rich. The ice caps are receding, and it will very quickly become a battleground. It always has been under the ice caps between submarines. But as those ice caps recede and more opportunity is available for mining minerals, it will become a battleground. And as those sea lanes open up, and NATO is woefully unprepared for any battles in the high north. And I think you can see, if you look at recent exercises, NATO has been involved in a lot more exercises in the high north and doing maritime exercises in the Baltic. We had an aircraft carrier over there just last year that did extended exercises in the North Sea and in the North Atlantic to see if we still remember how to operate in a cold weather environment. So the motivations from all these NATO countries are all very, very different, and trying to herd all those different nations to work and together, moving in the same direction, is quite challenging. And then you also have to remember that they're all sovereign nations. They all have their own challenges. They all have their own systems of government. And in a parliamentary system of government, governments may change quite regularly. So for a country to set down a defense posture or defense strategic plan, that may only last a year and a half, and a new government comes in that is diametrically opposed to the previous government's defense spending plan, and then it all changes and all falls apart. So NATO, sometimes you have to think of it as a big club, and the best leverage that nations have, especially the small ones, are entering into alliances with other nations so they can protect each other in voting blocks. It's almost like Survivor, the TV show Survivor, how you're getting alliances and a lot of backroom discussions to ensure that your nation can at least have some say in the way they want to go. So in
that context, can NATO function without United States?
No, it's no longer NATO without the United States. So one of the principal foundation principles of NATO is the nuclear umbrella that the United States provides. That's not something that's talked about very often, but it is absolutely an underlying principle of NATO. So there's a rule in NATO that no one country can provide more than 50% of any one capability, except for the United States, because the United States has certain capabilities that nobody else has. So aircraft carriers, there's several countries that have one. The UK now has two, but they are nowhere near the capabilities of American aircraft carriers. So for nuclear weapons, that's another one, and submarines, another one. We have more aircraft carriers, more submarines, more nuclear weapons than every other NATO country combined. So for the United States to pull out, NATO would cease to exist effectively. It would cease to be an effective force. What NATO does is, number one, it provides a vehicle through which nations can work together in the case that there was another global conflict, and they have that mutual protection. That's the Article 5. So if one nation is attacked, then other nations will come to their aid. That is the founding guideline. Number two, NATO was created in a sense to stop the European nations from warring against each other. It was commonly said that NATO was created to keep Germany down and to keep Russia out. So NATO, and I saw this firsthand, NATO became a forum through which nations could work out disagreements that wasn't in public view of United Nations. Greece and Turkey are a great example of that. There's so many times that where something may have come to blows between Greece and Turkey, they were worked out instead in a multilateral environment within NATO that wasn't privy to the rest of the world because it was within NATO. And then the third part is the idea of keeping Russia out. It's to prevent, when it was created, the idea that a ascending Russia may threaten less powerful NATO countries. So it's all about really providing stability. And NATO now, whereas the European countries may not have the same capabilities as America, it is absolutely vital. NATO is absolutely vital to ensuring future cooperation between those countries, and that we're all marching in the same direction.
In that vein, how do you see, or what is your take on Finland and Sweden looking to join NATO?
I think it's a great thing. I really do. And keep in mind that Finland and Sweden have been, in Finland not as much. They were forced into conflict during World War II and before World War II. But Sweden has always tried to maintain a neutral stance. So this is a huge right turn for both Sweden and Finland to do this. And they didn't do this in a vacuum. They didn't do this because they're always aspiring to be part of NATO. They did this because they were forced into that position by the bellicose actions by Russia. And let me touch on something there also. The idea that Russia attacked Ukraine because they were concerned that Ukraine was going to be part of NATO is absolute false. It is a complete fallacy. Ukraine could never have become part of NATO as long as there was instability on the Ukrainian border with Russia. Because there are certain things that a country has to do to qualify for NATO membership. And one of those is that you have to have stable borders. The other is that you have to have a stable system of government, and that you have to have a military that is also somewhat compatible with the NATO military. So we had NATO advisors there, but it was really just to help guide Ukraine in its quest to become a functioning democratic country, more so than it was for it to be a member of NATO. So as long as Putin was incurring on the borders of Ukraine, then Ukraine could never become a NATO member. And Vladimir Putin knows this. And the idea that NATO is expanding at a rate that is uncomfortable to Russia. NATO does not go out and solicit nations to become a part of NATO. That's against their charter. They don't do that. It is members can only become, or nations can only become a member if they voluntarily ask to do so. They have to go through a referendum in their own country. They have to vote on it. The government has to vote on it, and then they have to come to NATO and ask them if they can become a member. The idea of NATO recruiting other new members is absolutely ludicrous. It's NATO is a defensive organization that does not go out and solicit new members. They're not a gang. They're not it's not a fraternity that goes out and tries to get new members. So all of these new member nations that have come in have done so because they're scared of Russia, and they're scared of Russia's bellicose nature in the past several years, what they did with the Crimea, what they did with Putin has done in Georgia. And Putin's actions in Georgia steeled NATO to say, we are never going to allow this to happen again. We can't. And so it caused a heightened awareness amongst Eastern European nations that they wanted to be part of NATO so as that wouldn't happen to them again.
So you feel that Georgia was a wake-up call?
Absolutely. Oh my goodness. I arrived at NATO, maybe about a year after Georgia, and it was forefront on everybody's mind. And many of the bureaucrats in NATO the civilian bureaucrats who have been there were deeply ashamed that, I don't know if ashamed is the right word, but they were shaken by it because they felt that they were asleep at the wheel. And then they realized that NATO was not ready, that they weren't ready mentally, they weren't ready materially. And Ukraine only drove that point home unequivocally.
Now, going forward, first of all, it's important to acknowledge that Putin was objecting to Ukraine. You know, he was using this idea that Ukraine was going to join NATO, even though he was literally doing things that would forbid Ukraine from joining NATO by causing instability in the eastern part of the country. So he was in control of not letting Ukraine join NATO, and yet he was using that as an excuse, as one of the justifications for invasion. But going forward, one of the things that is going to be important to ending the war is to have for Ukraine security guarantees. And from the point of view of, I think, many Ukrainians, joining NATO would be one of those security guarantees. How do you see going forward prospects of is Ukraine now more likely? I mean, if we're training them on all sorts of NATO weapons and, and the Ukrainian army is being trained on NATO standards, they're like de facto becoming a NATO army. But of course, it's a big difference still between de facto and de jure, but still, how do you see the end of this war and Ukraine's membership in NATO?
I honestly, I don't see Ukraine becoming a member of NATO anytime soon. each new country has to be voted on by all of the other member nations. And it only takes one nation to say no in order to bar entry. So it's like one nation can blackball a new nation coming in. If NATO were to become if Ukraine were to become a member of NATO, then immediately Article 5 would be triggered. And then now we find ourselves in a situation where we have to come to the aid of Ukraine. So in other words, by voting Ukraine into NATO, then the member nations would be voting themselves into World War III.
But what if it take place after they sign some kind of a peace agreement with Russia, and part of that peace agreement, so there's peace, is that Ukraine has a chance of joining NATO?
My goodness. I think as long as Vladimir Putin is in power, I don't think that would happen. And again, because of member nations being very, very worried that if they did that, it would trigger something else within Putin. Now, personally, I think Vladimir Putin is very good at playing a bluff game. He's very good at putting all of his anteing all in, and then he scares folks away by doing that. We have lost in the West. I think we've lost the stomach for that. We tend to play the diplomacy card a little bit too much. So it would be countering in order to, if we allowed Ukraine to join NATO post-invasion, it would be calling Putin's bluff again. So we'd be saying, yeah, we're going to let Ukraine in. What are you going to do about it? Because Putin knows that any war with the West and with NATO would be disastrous, absolutely disastrous for Russia. I'm not saying he'd lose. I'm not saying that he would even be ousted from power, but the material and personnel cost would be it would be unthinkable, I think, to both sides. So is that something that he would want to enter into? Only if he felt that Ukraine entering NATO would mean his own personal demise, which, as I said before, I think he associates with the nation of Russia itself.
All right. Let's take a look at the nuclear threat, because it is something that Kremlin, Putin, Russia seems to use as a wake-up call in the morning. Let's talk about nuclear threat. Good morning. And we see that Putin announced that he's planning on moving nuclear weapons to Belarus, which is making more people uneasy. This is that possibly bluff, possibly blackmail. It's kind of hard to tell the difference until afterwards. But what is your evaluation of the threat that Russia presents right now as a nuclear power? Is this has it been done so much that it lost its value as a threat?
No.
How do you look at it?
No, Russia's threat is in tactical nuclear weapons. So the battlefield use of tactical nuclear weapons. So these are lower yield weapons that might have a 5 to 10 mile destruction radius. Sort of the weapons that may not destroy a city, but could destroy small towns type thing. Because the Russian tactical doctrine allows battlefield commanders to have control of tactical nukes once they've been given that authority by the president. Within our wargaming in NATO, we often wargamed that Russia used a tactical nuclear weapon against naval assets in the Baltic, and then immediately afterwards would say, as the Western nations are trying to decide what to do in response to that, the Russians then would immediately say, no, this was a mistake. This was a rogue battlefield commander that did this. This should not have happened. And what they'll say publicly, but everybody knows that this was a warning. So they do it at sea, where NATO would lose a couple of ships, but there would be no civilian casualties. So casualties would be minimized, but it was a demonstration that this is what we're going to do, and we're going to keep on doing it. But publicly, they would say that it was a mistake, a rogue commander. And I think that is kind of in the vein of what they would do, using propaganda to allow them to do the unthinkable. And again, it's calling the bluff of the Western nations. And if the danger of Putin using nuclear weapons is if he is left with no option. That's his bluff. Don't push me too far. Don't push me to a place where I'm in a corner, or I'm going to come out with my claws are going to come out. And that's part of his bluff, and that's part of why Western nations have been so reticent to give full unfettered support to Ukraine because of that fear. It's like I said before, we have become very bad at the bluff claim. We were pretty good at it in the 80s, but now I think we've lost the stomach for it. So yes, to answer your question, yes, I is absolutely a valid threat.
So what is the good way to deter that threat, in your opinion? If we were to have the stomach, what should we be doing?
Gosh, if I knew that, I'd be chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff right now. I think that it is supporting the Ukrainians in the absolute maximum way that we can, to ensure that they have the best chance of success, and that we don't want to come into a situation where we are in direct contact with the Russians, like there was last week where a U.S. drone was taken down by the Russians.
That was going to be my next question. Again, planes,
yeah.
What is? Yeah, go ahead.
But so my fear is not that there's a direct conflict between the great powers. My fear is that because of our aligning, we're starting to align almost like an Axis and allies type thing. Russia has fewer and fewer allies, or people, not even allies, just people that she can count on to buy her goods, her oil, her resources in order to fund this war. So my fear is that there's something happens in a proxy way that becomes a trigger, a la Russia declaring war on Austria-Hungary after Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia after the murder of Archduke Ferdinand in 1914. So it is a domino effect that does that. So the West has to try and avoid doing that. So if there is a chance for escalation, that we do everything we can to de-escalate it, and we keep communication lines open between the Pentagon and the Kremlin. And there is a direct line. There's in the basement of the Pentagon, there's an office that has an open phone line between the Kremlin and the Pentagon. And there's a staff of officers that sit in there waiting for the phone to ring that are all fluent Russian speakers. It was right across the hallway from me, to ensure that those lines of communication are always open. That's absolutely vital. And that's really, I mean, it sounds strange that we are giving weapons to a proxy country to kill Russian soldiers, but yet we still have lines of communication open. But that's because both sides recognize that if we don't do that, if there is no communication, that's when bad things happen.
Has that phone ever rang while you were around?
Yeah, it rings every day just to test it. But,
really?
Yeah. But not to my knowledge. When I was there, no, there was no need for an emergency use of it, to my knowledge.
As you mentioned, the episode that we just saw between a drone and a Russian pilot could have been, I think, if there was political interest, it could have led to a war, to a hot war. But there doesn't seem to be a political interest. To what extent the reality on the ground is subject to political will? Yeah,
it is. It's always. I mean, that is Clausewitz saying that war is the extension of
diplomacy.
Diplomacy by other means. Exactly, and that is political will. It is how much political will is there to enter into a conflict, and I do not think that there is any will or desire for Vladimir Putin to enter into a full-scale conflict with the West, because as I said, he knows what that would look like, unless he felt that there was no way out. I do not feel confident that he is humble enough to back off. I think when his back is against the wall, that he will do what he thinks is necessary in order to get the outcome that he wants, no matter how little those chances may be.
Even though Russian plane attacked American drone, we're talking about Russia not having appetite for war with NATO. What about? But there isn't any appetite from America either. I'm guessing because it goes into
No,
nuclear realm.
that's right. No, there's zero appetite here. But because this is, as I said before, this is what I believe is a war between. It is the front line between totalitarianism and pluralism, between Western liberal thought and a an 18th or 19th century version of imperialism mixed with, I think Vladimir Putin is a mix of Stalinist thinking and imperial czarist thinking. It's kind of a melding of the two. So he is thinking in early 20th century, 19th century thought, and it's a fight between that type of thought and a fight between modern Western pluralism. And that is a fight, I think, that happens between the great nations as a proxy war, just like Vietnam was a proxy war of communism versus democracy.
Captain Kinsella, if let's see, then I guess the question would be, one of the things that is being bandied about now is that maybe we don't have enough ammunition, enough supplies. Yes, we're looking to build up our military industrial complex and then kind of get it up from its knees. You know, after the Cold War, there was this winding down, and now we're winding up again. But that takes time. How do you look at our supply chain, our ability to help Ukraine for the foreseeable future? Is there going to be a time when we could run out of the bullets and rockets to send?
I'm very glad you asked that question. Recently, a couple of weeks ago, there was an article in the New York Times about how Ukraine is using about 90,000 artillery shells a month. The United States can produce about 15,000 shells a month. So do the math. It's pretty simple. That we are depleting our stockpiles in the United States at an alarming rate to feed the Ukrainian fight. And we're not necessarily able to replenish our own stockpiles fast enough. So if you look at that within a vacuum and you say, well, that's leading to disaster. We're leaving ourselves vulnerable and unprepared for future conflict. No, I don't think so. There are lots of levers that we can pull in order to ramp up that production where necessary. Now, it takes a lot for us to do that, but nothing in Washington, D.C. and nothing in the Capitol, or nothing in Washington, D.C. or nothing in the Pentagon happens unless there's a crisis that makes it happen. We're very, very bad in the Pentagon and Washington, D.C. for doing things because there's an existential threat. We do it because there's an immediate crisis, and then that unlocks the blockages that naturally happen in bureaucracy to make things happen. And I think this is one of those moments where the fight in Ukraine has helped our politicians and flag officers and general officers realize that we need more capacity than we have. It is exercising the system. Let's say it's exercising our muscle movements in how we would supply ourselves in a time of conflict. And so that propels us into action to ensure that we do have the required logistics in order to support ourselves. So I think in a way, this could be a very good thing for the United States because it really shows us what we need. General Rumsfeld said, and he was ridiculed for it, but he was absolutely right, that you fight with the military you have, not the military you want. And now this has perhaps propelled the Pentagon to start creating the military that we need with a little bit more impetus.
What are some of those levers that you feel could be used to increase the production quickly?
Oh, it all comes down to Congress. I'm not sure that we could do it quickly, but it all comes down to Congress and funding and getting the right funding in order to increase that production. And no, it couldn't happen quickly. It would take us some time, and I couldn't put a timeline on that because I'm not an expert on it. But it's also our allies. What this conflict has done has also given our allies a glimpse into what the future could look like. You've seen an increase in spending for all NATO allies, still not to where we would like to see it be. It's still, I think there's only 2 or 3 countries that have reached 2% of GDP in military spending. But what NATO does, it allows an economy of force. So it allows us to combine our production efforts together to be able to get to where we want. So I think I don't know this for sure, but I'm quite certain that the Pentagon is trying to leverage that with our member nations, also to increase production.
Captain Kinsella, I'd like to gauge through your eyes, and what is the opinion of the war in Ukraine from American military, from regular service members? How do people view what's going on? Do they feel like this? I just don't know. Tell me what you think.
Number one, fascination, because it is this is the greatest conflict on European soil since 1945. This is, really the first. The U.S. military has prepared for a European war since World War II, and we took our eye off the ball since 9/11. And now it is back. The focus is back onto a European style war, with also a focus in the Pacific. So now we're looking more. Creating capabilities that are more akin to a World War II type situation where we've got conflict in the Pacific and in Europe. So there's a great fascination from the military in looking at it to now there's a war that fits the capabilities that we've been building for 75 years. Our aircraft carriers are not built to operate in warm waters of the Persian Gulf or the Gulf of Arabia, or the Gulf of Oman. They're built to operate in the North Atlantic. The same, our tanks. Our tanks are built to operate on Eastern European fields. They're not built to operate in the desert. So now we have a conflict that is more akin to the military that we've been building. So that's kind of the fascination part of it, to see what those tactics look like. And now we're really getting to see what Russia fights like. And we're fascinated at how well the Ukrainians have done with such little with so few resources. We're fascinated to look at the mistakes that Russia has been making. At the beginning of the war, a 40-mile convoy full of armored vehicles. It's an A-10 pilot's dream to just go along that convoy with that 20-millimeter cannon blazing down there, tearing up everything in its path. You do not start a war in Eastern Europe in springtime. Why? Because of the mud. You don't do it because it confines all of your tracked vehicles to roadways. You can't move. So why in heaven's name would you do that? The ability of the Ukrainians to use asymmetrical warfare. So it's using things like drones, using cell phones to figure out where Russian positions are. It's how bad the Russians have been at their tactics. Not bad, but non-existent tactics. If you look at some of the videos of Russian helicopters, there was one in particular I remember watching, 3 Russian helicopters flying along, and you can see a man-pad is shot, and you see the missile going straight for the lead helicopter. There's no evasive tactics, nothing. It just keeps flying in a straight line, and they get shot down. The other 2 behind it, no evasive tactics. They just keep on flying in a straight line, and they're shot down also. That is incredulous to any helicopter pilot in any Western force. You don't even need electronic signature in order for you to do it. You see it with your own 2 eyes. What in heaven's name are you doing flying in the same way? So there's a fascination in that way. There's also a increased impetus to be really good at what we do, to train harder, to train more realistic. It is giving us wealth of intelligence on how the Russians fight and how their systems operate in adverse conditions, how well their operators operate that equipment. That has been pretty amazing to see. So it's not worry. I think it's more fascination looking at it. We we look at how the Russians have fought, and then what I maybe worry about is that it has given us a increased sense of superiority, maybe, because we would fight that war very, very different. But there is a quality in numbers that the Russian military is willing to throw into a problem that has a whole quality all of its own. So I'd say it's been fascinating for military members to watch. It really has.
Then to conclude, let's bring it back to the planes. Do you feel that Ukraine needs to have American NATO planes in order to win, or can Ukraine win without the planes?
So planes, what planes do for you is that they allow you to dominate the airspace. So that means that you would have unfettered control of access to ground forces behind enemy lines. For example, in the battle for Normandy, World War II, the Allies had unfettered access to control of the skies. That meant that when the Germans were surrounded on three sides in the Falaise pocket, American planes could go in there and absolutely batter them. And they sustained huge losses because they had nothing to counter. So if you have control of the skies, that means that you have pretty much control of the ground, and you have control of your enemy's supply routes. So how do you prevent control of the skies? You do it in two ways, actually three ways. You either you deny access to the air by your enemy. How do you do that? Well, you can either do it by blowing up all his planes, either on the ground or with your own air force, or you do it by creating areas that are inaccessible to him through your own air defense systems, such as surface-to-air missile sites and so forth. So it doesn't necessarily have to happen with other jets. It can happen with ground-based surface-to-air missiles that deny the airspace to the Russians. Bringing aircraft into the situation may complicate it because of all the things we talked about before, the logistics, the training, the manning, and all those things. So we shouldn't think about this linearly, as in Ukraine can't control the airspace if they don't have aircraft. They can do that. So you think, what do aircraft bring to the fight? They bring just an added layer of complexity to their air defense. It would be very difficult for the Ukrainians to use aircraft to enter into Russian-controlled airspace, because Russian anti-aircraft systems are very complex. They're very, very capable. So really, I would see aircraft being used more as a defensive posture for the Ukrainians, which surface-to-air missiles are already doing. So it has to be done deliberately, and it has to be done with a goal in mind, and what you're going to be using them for. It's not a prestige thing. It's not a give us aircraft just because the Russians have them. If we're denying the Russians access to the Ukrainian airspace, then they're doing the same job that aircraft would do. If you want to use them in an offensive capability, that's a whole different story. But our long-range rocket artillery systems are doing a pretty good job at that too. So the question I asked is, what do you want them for? And then can you achieve that goal with the use of aircraft, or do you have other means of doing it that are less expensive, more readily available, and less risky?
Captain Tim Kinsella, retired, former commanding officer at Naval Air Station Base in Pensacola, and currently, director of the Ailstock, Whitkin, Kreis, and Overholt Center for Leadership in the University of Western Florida College of Business. Thank you so much for your service, for your expertise, for taking the time to share it with our listeners. Just a lot of really interesting information. Hope to be able to continue speaking with you in the future. And thank you so much for your time, sir.
Thank you, Yuri. I really appreciate being on here, and I hope some of my comments were helpful. But thank you.
Absolutely. You're listening and watching Rashkin Report. My name is Yuri Rashkin. Press like, subscribe to this channel, distribute this video in your social media. And until we meet again, take care.